Hello, you are listening to a recording produced exclusively for MJam from London. It is not commercially available anywhere, and the audio reading is copyright to MJam from London and this YouTube channel. The reader is Matthew Jones. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for listening.
Now, sir, according to your statement, a number of people had reasons for disliking the young lady who was killed. Let me detail them. Let's see. Number 1, Mr. Robert Warner. He knew Miss Haskell at some time earlier, and you think he had an affair with her. In addition, the young lady had been very persistent with him since his arrival, and apparently the night before last placed him in a compromising position, he being attached to another young lady, Miss Rachel West. 2, Miss West herself, for the reasons aforesaid, that is to say, she was jealous of Miss Haskell on account of Mr. Warner. 3, Mr. Donald Fellows, who, although in love with Miss Haskell, was enraged at her deserting him in favour of Mr. Warner, and moreover disapproved of her risque behaviour on the stage. Oh, come. 4, Miss Jean Whiteleg, who is in love with Mr. Fellows, and while resenting his infatuation for Miss Haskell, considered also that she, Miss Haskell, was trifling with his, Mr. Fellows's, affections. He contemplated this further evidence of the activities of the Venus Pandemus with increasing dismay. Nigel suppressed a desire to giggle. 5, Mr. Nicholas Berkeley, who considered that Mr. Fellows was wasting his talents over his infatuation with Miss Haskell, and moreover disliked her on general grounds. Well, that hardly seems to be a motive, sir. And as to the first part of it, I confess I don't see what you mean.
Sir Richard, about to embark on a disquisition on the value of artists to society, thought better of it, and was silent.
Well, no, admitted Nigel. That was only my impression, you understand, and of course there may be other people I know nothing about who had much stronger reasons for disliking you yet. She was not popular. So I gather, but I think perhaps we've enough to go on here for the moment.
I suppose.
I hope I haven't laid myself open to half a dozen slander accusations by saying this. No, sir, you were officially asked to give your impressions, and you gave them. Oh, yes, indeed you did. But that's all there is to it. No blame attaches to you, even if those impressions prove to have been incorrect. Right. Very well.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes, Constable.
Captain Graham. Did you want to see him now?
Ah, yes. Show him in.
Peter Graham looked much chastened. His youthful buoyancy had gone, and the lines of an unpractised and therefore slightly incongruous earnestness furrowed his brow. He greeted Nigel anxiously, and sat down on the edge of a chair with his hands in his lap. Yes, the gun, he said, was his. He had discovered that it was missing on the day after the party, when he was tidying up his room. He had, he explained irrelevantly, but not surprisingly, an appalling hangover, and had been very much distressed to find the gun gone. Yes, he'd heard what had happened. Poor little devil. He held himself partly responsible. Yes, he did. But, dash it, one doesn't anticipate these things, and doubtless it would have happened somehow or other, even if no one had known he possessed the thing. It was not he added, who had taken it out and waved it about for everyone to see. Asked why he'd not reported the loss to the police, he said that first, he had felt very ill for the past few days, and second, that someone might have taken it as a joke and would return it. Asked if he had any notion who might have taken it, he said he had none. Some questions were then put to him about his relationship with Yuziette, but beyond the fact that she talked to him in the train, that he had seen her in the bar on the Monday evening, and that she had come to his party, he had no information to give. He had not thought about her very much at all, he said, though yes, he supposed she was attractive. Of her private affairs he knew nothing, She had seemed very drunk at the party, and had got into a temper with him when he took the gun away from her. But then parties were parties, and alcohol, he averred, did queer things to women. He was quite bewildered about the whole thing. He could think of no reason why she should commit suicide, or, for that matter, why she should not. And in fact, thought Nigel, he does look genuinely bewildered. Rising to go, he asked if he could have his gun back, but was told it must be kept as evidence. When Spencer had finished taking his prints, he went out with an expression of profound unhappiness on his face.
"Oh, that'll have to be confirmed. It's possible, I suppose, that he knows more about the girl than he'll admit, but we must look for the obvious first and go into the other things afterwards. I must admit that the attack the girl made on him seems queer on the face of it."
He sighed. It was wearing, he reflected, having to conduct a case with the chief constable sitting over you all the time. Fenn had asked no question during the interview, though he had listened with some care, but his manner had become markedly cheerful, and Sir Richard, with the blind faith of the early Christian martyrs, had in consequence paid no attention at all. "His prints are the old ones on the barrel and chambers," said Spencer, who had been comparing them, "and there are some latent prints belonging to the girl, presumably when she handled the gun at the party." Williams was next to be questioned, somewhat the worse for a couple of hours of college beer, and inclined to be boisterous. The girl had come in, he thought, about 20 minutes before he heard the shot, but at what time exactly he could not say. She said good evening to him, and since he thought her an attractive bit of goods, though not wishing to speak ill of the dead, he had returned the compliment with what he described as a winsome smile.
"Did anyone pass you down the passage between the time you came in and the time you heard the shot?"
"Yes, sir, one gentleman, tall and dark, a bit lanky, but I takes a look at him over my shoulder, and I see he goes straight upstairs to the professor's room."
"That'll be Robert Warner. What time would that have been?"
"About 5 or 10 minutes after the young lady, I suppose." "Do you know?" "I couldn't say for certain."
"And you saw no one else during that interval? You'd be prepared to swear that?"
Well, no, sir, I saw no one else, I am certain of that."
"Mr. Fenn, where does the archway opposite lead to, sir? Just another set of rooms?"
"Well, there's a scout's pantry on the right as you go in, a sitting room on the left, a staircase up to a small bedroom over the pantry, and then a way through to a paved courtyard beyond."
"That leads where?"
"Oh, it's enclosed, except for a small door on the west side which leads to the street."
"Well, is that door left open?"
"Until 9 o'clock, yes."
"Aha! Now, Williams, no one came through from that courtyard during the time I mentioned, I suppose?"
"Not likely. They'd have had a fall over me if they had. Mr. Fellows and another gentleman came over from here and into the other fellow's sitting room. That was earlier in the evening, just before you gentlemen came in from dinner.
But that was all. Tell us what you did when you heard the shot."
"I nipped in here quick as lightning, and finding the young lady, well, as you saw her—" "Be more precise. What do you mean by quick as lightning? Exactly and in detail, what did you do?"
"Well, sir, I was just about to knock off work as it was getting too dark to do anything further. That's when I heard it. So I lifts up my head and I says to myself, 'Did you hear what you thought you just heard?' And then I puts my tools away in my bag and goes to see. I leaves it on the steps."
"Well," said Sir Richard, "I don't call that as quick as lightning. How long did it take you to put your tools away?"
Well, I couldn't say exactly, sir, I'm afraid."
"Well, I'll put it another way. How long were you in the bedroom before we came down?"
"Only a moment or two, sir."
"Well, then, it was just under 2 minutes by the time we arrived. It seems as if your account needs revising a bit, Williams. Tell me, Williams, could you see into the windows of this room or of the rooms opposite?"
"I can't say as how I looked, sir, but it was so dark I shouldn't have been able to see nothing if I had."
"Did the shot sound very loud?"
"The wireless was making a lot of noise, if you remember. I can't say it sounded very loud. Not to make you jump like."
"Did you see or hear Mr. Warner come down to the lavatory?"
"No, sir. But there's a carpet on them stairs. I was facing the opposite direction. I wouldn't have done. I may have heard the door shut behind him, but I wouldn't swear to it."
Well, that's not very helpful. Very well, thank you. For now. Aye, sir. Well, I suppose we shouldn't have expected much. There's one thing, though. We've established no one came into this room after the girl. Well, we are assuming, that she remained in one or other of these rooms from the time she came in to the time she was shot. Where else would she have gone? She might have gone up the staircase to the door to my room without coming in, or she may have gone to the lavatory. Well, that'll have to be investigated. For the moment, we'd better see Parsons, the porter. Try to get these times settled. Nigel seized the opportunity of going up to Fenn's room and ringing Helen. He found Robert reading there when he arrived, but he only nodded and returned to his book. Helen herself answered the stage door telephone. Nigel told her without beating about the bush what had happened. There was a long silence at the other end. Then she said softly, "Oh, my God! How did it happen?" "Well, at the moment it looks like suicide." "But why?" "Heaven knows, darling. I don't. I can't say I'm really sorry, though I suppose I ought to be. It's shock. Do they know when it happened? Everything's in a frightful mess here. Jane had to go on in her place, dried every few seconds. Sheila's furious." "It was about 2 hours ago." 2 hours? Oh, my God!" "Helen, darling, you all right? Shall I come round?" No, dearest. I'll be all right. I suppose the police will want to ask me questions." "I'm afraid so. They'll be coming round in the morning." "All right, Nigel. I must go now, finish taking my makeup off. It's so cold here I've got next to nothing on." "Well, God bless, darling. See you in the morning." "Yes, dear, of course." Nigel rang off and returned downstairs. Parsons, the porter, was on the point of leaving when he arrived. He was, as Nigel remembered him, a large, formidable man with horn-rimmed glasses, whose attitude of invariable ferocity and aggressiveness combined ill with his status in the college. Like all the other college porters, he had read, Nigel suspected, in innumerable books on Oxford, the statement that the porter is the uncrowned king of his college, and this conception had deeply affected his outlook, refusing to be eradicated by many years of bitter experience to the contrary. His attitude to undergraduates was one of overt intimidation, incongruously combined with the conventional expressions of civility, and he respected none of them except those who declined to be intimidated. In any generation these were few in number, but Nigel had been one of them, and was greeted with warmth on his appearance. His evidence was brief and to the point. "Yes, sir, young lady entered the college at 6 minutes to 8, sir. I looked automatically at the clock, since women are not allowed in after 9. She went, as far as I was able to see, direct to Mr. Fellows's room. Mr. Warner came in at 5 past, and inquired his way to Mr. Fenn's room, also going there direct. After, of course, I ascertained that he was expected. No other strangers came in since dinner. Though Mr. Fellows brought a guest to hall earlier in the evening, about 6:30, I think. Members of the college have been in and out as usual. I cannot remember who or at what times." He retired with dignity, leaving the inspector looking a little better pleased with himself. "Well, then, that's it. Oh, thank heavens we can go up to my room now and sit in comfort." Robert put down his book and rose to his feet as they appeared. He greeted them in turn, and asked a few amiable questions about how things were going. Fenn collapsed into an armchair and pleaded with him to pour out some whisky. They all had some, and the others settled down more austerely. Spencer bustled about taking Robert's fingerprints. "Now, Mr. Warner, just a few things, if you don't mind." "By all means." "You were acquainted with Miss Haskell?" "Yes, I met her in town at a first-night party rather more than a year ago. We were friendly for a few weeks, then she left to come back here. We did not communicate with each other, but of course we met again when I came here." "And what is your business in Oxford, Mr. Warner?" "I'm producing a new play of mine at the Repertory Theatre." "Quite so. You arrived when?" "Sunday. Rehearsals didn't begin till Tuesday, but I wanted a day to look around and get acquainted with the company." "And your relations with Miss Haskell were—" "Well, truth to tell, extremely poor. She wasn't the sort of person to make herself liked at the best of times, and when I arrived, well, she threw herself at my head and wanted to reopen our previous affair. I'd no desire to do anything of the sort, so naturally things became a bit difficult. Also, she was a poor actress, couldn't or wouldn't take direction, and constantly criticised the play and the production behind my back. In general, I frankly admit that she was determined to be a damned nuisance in every way." "I see. Right. Thank you, sir. Not to speak ill of the dead, of course." "No, sir, no." I take it then you gave the lady no encouragement in her attachment to you?" "None whatever." "She didn't visit your room on Wednesday night? You must forgive me asking a personal question like that, but I can assure you that unless your answer is in any way relevant to the case, it wouldn't go any further." "Well, no, she did not, unless she crept in while I was asleep. I saw nothing of her." "On that Wednesday night, Mr. Warner, did you, or were you—" "I'm sorry?"
I think the inspector wishes to ask," put in Sir Richard, cutting short his desperate search for a suitable euphemism, "whether you were sleeping with Miss West on that night." Oh, no. As a matter of fact, I wasn't."
"Thank you, sir. You were present at the party. No doubt you observed the incident with the revolver."
"Oh, God, yes. In fact, I was a party to it.
The little Usiette insisted I should knock Graham down for taking it away from her. She was pretty tight by that time, quite so. What time did you leave the party? Were you one of the last to leave?" "I think so, yes. Rachel and I went straight to our rooms, muttered a few commonplaces about the unpleasantness of parties in general, and Usiette in particular, and said good night. Then I undressed, went to the bathroom, took some aspirin to get rid of any after-effects." "That's characteristic of a man," thought Nigel. "And went to bed. I read for half an hour or so, then went to sleep." "Were you up early next morning?"
8 o'clock, if you count that early."
"I don't."
"I asked for you when I came down," put in Nigel, suddenly suspicious.
"And the porter said he hadn't seen you. And the head waiter said, well, you hadn't been in to breakfast."
"Oh, well, I went straight for a walk, as it happens. I very seldom eat breakfast.
It's rather bad for you, you know, Nigel."
"Really?
Then you didn't return to your room at any time before 10 o'clock?
"No, why should I?
Rachel, unlike myself, never gets up early, and I did not expect to see her before 10:30. Did you see anyone on your walk?"
"Oh, a few people about, not anybody I know."
"I may say, Inspector, if you're trying to prove I spent the night with Usiette, you're going to have a very hard job of it. You are aware that Miss Haskell went to your room the following morning?"
"So she told me."
"Have you any idea why she went there?"
"Not the slightest."
"You're sure, sir?" "Yes, damn you, I'm sure." "Very well, sir. Now, as to this evening, would you mind detailing your movements during the latter part of the day?"
"Rehearsal finished at 4:30. I went back with Rachel to the hotel, and we had tea together. At 6 o'clock we went and had a drink in the bar with Donald Fellows and Nicholas Berkeley, who went off just after 1:30. Rachel left shortly afterwards to have dinner with some friends in North Oxford, and I dined alone at the hotel. Then I returned to the bar, and some time towards 8 left to come here." "Were you in the bar after dinner with anyone you knew?" "No."
"And you don't know exactly what time you left?"
"Good heavens, no, not exactly. Is it important?"
"It may be, sir. Then again, it may not. We're trying to collect what details we can. Can you tell me how Miss West reacted to Miss Haskell's advances to yourself?"
Robert suddenly looked worried. I was surprised to find she was very annoyed, though usually she's extremely sensible about these things.
"And it wasn't as if the advances, as you call them, were being reciprocated?"
"Yes, she was annoyed,
both with me and Usiette, though with no justification in the former case. If she was generally sensible about these things, as you put it, then surely—" "I say she had no justification whatever."
The inspector leaned back, a rather fatuous smile of complacency.
"And on arriving here?"
"I stopped at the lodge to ask my way to this room, as I did not know the place at all. Then I came straight up here, listened to a pleasant little ghost story for 10 minutes or so, and then slipped out for a minute to go to the lavatory.
While I was in there, I heard an explosion close at hand, and when I came out, I met the others coming down the stairs. The rest you know. Were you carrying gloves, Mr. Warner?" "Gloves? Good Lord, no, in this heat." "Thank you, sir. I think that's all for the moment. Sir Richard, Professor, have you anything you'd like to ask?" Sir Richard shook his head and looked inquiringly at Fenn.
"Just one thing. Do you know anything about Egypt, Warner?"
"I was there before the war, but I only know the tourist stuff, the sort of stuff anyone can pick up."
"Nothing about the symbolism of ancient Egyptian religion, for example?"
"No, nothing at all, I'm afraid." "Right, well, that's that, thank you." "Well, in that case, I'll be on my way." Fenn, becoming belatedly aware of his duties as host, surged hurriedly to his feet.
"My dear fellow, I really must apologize. I have given you a most abominable evening, haven't I? I'm afraid you'll never want to come here again. And I did so want to talk to you about your play. I shall see it on Monday night, and I would like to come to the rehearsal tomorrow, if I may."
"By all means, Professor Fenn. And for heaven's sake, don't apologize. It's not your fault if a murder is committed under our noses. I wish you the joy of it. Anything more I can do, well, let me know."
"Yes, I'm afraid this business is going to make things very difficult for you. You'll have to find someone short notice to play the girl's part."
"Oh, I'm not worried. Jane, the understudy, she's perfectly competent."
"Ah."
Roberts, after bowing slightly to Sir Richard, Nigel, and the inspector, turned back. "By the way, am I right in supposing that the gun which killed Yuziet is the one she was playing about with at the party? It seems the most likely thing." "Oh, yes, Mr. Warner. Someone, we don't know who, went back after the party and removed it." "In that case, I can help you a little more. You see, I saw the person who took it."
"You what?"
"Of course, I didn't realize what they were up to, not until this evening. But as I went to the bathroom on my way to bed, I saw someone slip into Graham's room without turning on the light, and come out again carrying something which at the time I didn't recognize. I simply thought that a guest at the party had left something behind."
"Yes, sir? And that person was?"
"Well, it was Jean Whiteleg." The inspector gazed at Robert severely. One felt that this surprising piece of information had existed all along at the bottom of his mind in a pure and immaterial form, and that he was offended at this brutal thrusting of it into the coarse and limited medium of words. He regarded Robert as a man might be regarded who has capped a particularly subtle and appropriate literary allusion with the hackneyed banality of a proverb. "You would swear to that?" The question was a perfectly rhetorical one. "Well, I'd swear to the fact that she went back to that room. Naturally, I can't be certain that she took the gun away with her. We may draw our own conclusions about that, sir." "Thank you, Mr. Warner. You've been very helpful. Very helpful indeed." Robert vanished almost imperceptibly from the room. The inspector cast about in his mind for words suitably expressive of gratified surprise, and, finding none, abandoned the responsibility of comment, and asked the company in general, "Well, now, what have we to say to that?" Nigel had nothing to say. There seemed nothing further to say at the moment. Doubtless it was interesting. "Interesting," he proffered, conscious of the futility. Fenn said, infuriatingly, "Entirely valueless. Well, it's something to be investigated." "Perhaps. Oh, yes, to be investigated." "And investigated it shall be. As to the rest of the interview, to me, at any rate, it appears obvious that Mr. Warner did spend that Wednesday night with Miss Haskell." "Well, if you think that has anything to do with the case, Quadri, doubtless you are right to be as persistent as you were. But you must remember that you are a policeman and not a watch committee." "Nonetheless, sir, you must admit it may well have some bearing on the matter in hand."
"Do you know, I'm getting very bored of all this. I shall go away if it continues. We have completely lost the point in a maze of routine investigation. There are only 2 points to decide. First, whether this was suicide. I've given the reasons why it obviously was not. Incidentally, did you notice there was no dent in the soft pinewood floor where the gun fell? Another slip. Secondly, since it is evidently murder, how was it done? There are only a few relevant questions to be asked, and the whole thing is over. Yet they have been submerged in a mass of irrelevant stuff. It's all very well in a detective novel, where it has to be put into camouflage for significant things. Though I must say I think some more entertaining form of camouflage might be devised. If I were... Now, Gervais, if there's anything I profoundly dislike, it's the sort of detective story in which one of the characters propounds views on how detective stories should be written. It's bad enough having a detective who reads for things. They all do. A gust of overwhelming fury smote the inspector. Now it is you who are wandering off the point. The problem is not to decide how the murder was done, though that may have its importance. The problem is to decide who did it. But we know that, don't we? The inspector seemed to be summoning up his resources for a titanic counterblast to this offensive suggestion. His lower jaw dropped and the blood rushed pinkly to his cheeks. No adequate rhetoric, however, was at his disposal, and regretfully dismissing the impulse to violent physical expression, he resorted to a heavy, subliminal irony. "You may know, sir?" "I do." Sir Richard was at once the incarnation of bluff, hearty common sense. "Nonsense, Gervais. I do know. I knew 3 minutes after we arrived in that room. 3 minutes? Oh, nonsense. Nonsense. Who then? Here we are. Mystification again. I know. Don't tell me. It can't come out till the last chapter, eh? Nothing of the sort. The case is not complete yet. I cannot imagine, in the first place, why this person would do such a thing. Good heavens, man, aren't there enough motives hanging around? But they're all sexual motives, my dear Dick. I don't believe in the crime passionnel, particularly when the passion appears, as in this case, to be chiefly frustration. Money, vengeance, security, there are your plausible motives, and I look for one of them. I confess, too, that certain details, though probably inessential, do puzzle me. Well, that is a relief. I think we'd better see Mr. Fellows next, He'll be up in a moment, said Nicholas, who'd appeared opportunely on the inspector's words. At the moment he's, on my instigation, engaged in being violently and repeatedly sick. He holds his liquor ill, you see. It's my opinion he should not be allowed to drink at all, or if he is, very little. May I ask how you're getting on? It's impossible to say at the moment. We progress, but in what direction? There's been no landmark of a sufficient size yet to enable us to tell. Do you still adhere to this absurd suicide theory? You disagree, then? Well, I mean, the idea is perfectly ridiculous. Yuziet was rich. Moreover, she's just succeeded in creating a situation full of the most uncomfortable possibilities. A wide, fecund horizon of mischief-making. To abandon that would be to abandon every principle she ever possessed. Anything to give pain, as Hamlet might have said. Certainly she would not have exchanged all that potential unpleasantness for being blown with restless violence round about the pendant world. Rachel, Jean, Donald, and Robert were all tied to her apron strings, or more exactly, perhaps I should say her shoulder straps, in an undignified huddle. I fear it was murder. Motive, either money or sex. Then has just been derogating sex as a possible motive. Murder is as near to lust as flame to smoke. A trite comparison. Beg your pardon, sir? It's a quotation from Pericles, Inspector, a dirty play about brothels by Shakespeare, of whom no doubt you have heard. Money, the girl was rich, you say? Quite tediously so. About 2,000 a year, I take it. Her sister Helen inherits, and while I'm on the subject, I ought perhaps to mention that Yuziet told Helen to the party the other night she was proposing to visit town shortly to alter her will. "What the hell are you suggesting?" said Nigel. Nicholas waved him aside. "These mistaken impulses of chivalry, Nigel, originally, as the inspector no doubt is aware, denoting an affection for horses, are wildly out of place." "You're prepared to swear to that, sir?" It was, Nigel thought, a perfectly unreflecting reflex action, which could be brought about by any particularly outrageous statement, like the salivating of Pavlov's dogs to the sound of a dinner bell. "Unlike yourself, Inspector," said Nicholas with mock severity, "I have no distinction between ordinary truth and truth under oath. Besides, I have an agnostic's mind, so there is nothing I could sincerely swear by." "No primary philosophical principle?" "Apart from the primary philosophical principle that there is no primary philosophical principle, no." "However, we're confusing the good Inspector. You may take it, Inspector, that I did in fact overhear this conversation." "Was anyone else present, sir?" "Innumerable people were present, Inspector. Whether any of them heard it, though, I could not say." At this point Fenn, who had been gazing critically at his features in a mirror at the other end of the room, turned and strode purposefully towards them. "You are being imbecile and Gijon," he said offensively to Nicholas. "Answer me a question. What were you and Fellows doing this evening in a room not belonging to either of you?" "We were listening to the wireless. Donald has none, and the owner of the room was out, so we took possession." "Did either of you leave the room at any time?" "No." "Did you hear the shot?" "Dimly. Heldendieben was going on at the time. Even though the windows were open, it wasn't startling." "Good heavens, boy! Do you mean to say that you were playing that thing with all the windows open?" "Well, it was hot." "You were playing the wireless with the windows open? Oh, my ears and whiskers!" The inspector gazed at him with polite astonishment. "Well, we have it at last. And what was on before Heldendieben, may I ask?" "A Meistersinger overture, I think." "The Meistersinger overture? Well, that's splendid, splendid. It's an admirable work, you know. Admirable, admirable." "Really, sir? Well, I hardly think I suspected it all along, you know. No, my dear man, not your powers of reasoning. The method, the method. We have it at last." "Ha, ha, ha. Is anyone else rather tired?" "I think that if Mr. Fellows has recovered—" No, just a minute. Hold on for a second. What time did you do the blackout?" Shortly before we heard the shot, I think." "Did you do it, or did Fellows?" "I did the windows on this side, and Donald did those on the courtyard side." "Did you notice anything unusual at the time?" "It was getting pretty dark by then, no." "Where did you sit?" "In a couple of armchairs by the fireplace." Who do you think the murderer is?" "I don't know. Robert or Rachel or Jean or Sheila McGaw." "Who?" "Sheila McGaw." "Well, she's a new one, Inspector. Tell us about her." "Well, she's a young woman of arty proclivities who regularly produces at the Repertory. At the time of Usiette's short-lived exercise on the West End stage, she was to be offered the job of producing the play in which Usiette was to appear. But that amiable young woman used her influence to lose Sheila the job, chiefly by publishing the fact that the woman's sexual reactions were not exactly normal. Sheila discovered about this, and not unnaturally took offence. You see, Professor, I know all the scandal. I am, I'm afraid, a latter-day Aubrey. What more could the police want? Apart from the fact that Aubrey could write, that he got tight when he drank a lot, and that he had a spontaneous and delightful sense of humour, no doubt there may be something in the comparison. Probably your information is quite as inaccurate as his was. If I remember rightly, he went so far as to insist that it was Ben Jonson who killed Marlowe. I mean to say." Donald Fellows, when he appeared, proved to be only partially recovered from the evening's carouse. The process of being sick had relieved the anaesthesia of his nerves, but the alcohol still crawled and sang and buzzed in his veins,
and as a consequence he was feeling not only depressed, but actively ill.
"Now, you sheep's head, what have you got to say for yourself?"
What?
"Are you sorry Yuziet is dead?" "You know, Nigel, this is the psychological method of detection."
What? Psychological? Nonsense. If you want to know, I feel only relieved, not sorry. You needn't suppose I killed her, because I have an alibi."
"And you think you have an alibi, do you? But if you suppose collusion between yourself and Nicholas Berkeley, you have nothing of the sort, do you?"
"You can't prove collusion."
"Did you practice the organ yesterday morning? And did you have a drink in the Mason's Sceptre beforehand?"
Yes, to both questions. I'm playing a very difficult prelude as a voluntary on Sunday."
"And you took your music to the bar with you?" Nigel was puzzled at the turn the questioning was taking.
"As it happens, I did."
"Lots of it?"
"A small pile."
"Ah. Your witness, Inspector. My interest in the proceedings is at an end."
"Right. Well, then." The inspector asked a number of questions about Donald's movements that evening, and about the episode of the gun, and about his relationship with Yuziet, but they learned nothing new. Nigel had the impression that the inspector was battering dutifully but ineffectively against a brick wall, that he was asking questions at random, simply in the hope that something would emerge, and that having for the moment abandoned the idea of suicide, he had been able to evoke no concrete line of inquiry to set in its place. With this state of mind Nigel profoundly sympathized. He himself was beginning to feel very tired, and, like Fenn, inclined to lose interest in the proceedings altogether. His earlier reaction to the murder he felt had been sentimental, and he was now inclined to believe that Yuziet's death might, from many points of view, not have been at all a bad thing if she'd been run over by a bus. The effect would have been the same, so why be disturbed by moral considerations? The Fiji Islanders, he reflected, murder their old men and women from the most admirable motives of social evolution. This was in his conscious mind. In the unconscious there lived and grew still a superstitious terror of death by violence, impervious to the niceties of rational calculation, and which the consciousness was attempting to suppress by refusing further speculation on the problem. Towards the end of the interview, Fenn's interest, apparently a very volatile affair, was roused again.
"What do you think of Jean Whiteleg?"
She's in love with me, I believe."
"Well, my dear man, we know that. You needn't be so complacent about it. Do you think she could have killed Yuziet?"
"Jean? No, I certainly don't know."
"Ah. What service are we having at evensong on Sunday?"
"Dyson in D."
"Oh, nice. Theatrical, but nice. You must come, Nigel. Musically, it's a battle of religion and romance, of Eros and Agape."
Right."
Nigel nodded, bewildered at these gnomic utterances.
Donald Fellows departed to bed in one of the guest chambers, first procuring some things from his bedroom under the eye of a policeman. The soporific atmosphere descended on Fenn, and on Nigel and Sir Richard and the inspector too. The latter two appeared now to be sustaining their interest with difficulty, and besides that it was now close to midnight. The inspector, returning with an heroic effort to the matter in hand, made a short attempt at condensation and summary. Certain specific things remain to be investigated. The alibis of the other people concerned, the question of whether the bullet came from the gun we found, though I've no doubt it did, the question of the young lady's will, the ownership of the ring, and one or two lesser matters. Sir Richard hurled a match, which for some moments he'd been applying without noticeable effect to the bowl of his pipe, inaccurately at the fireplace.
"It remains a mystery to me. How was that girl murdered, Could she have been shot from outside? And the window?"
"Even apart from the fact of the powder burns, I can't see how it could have been done. If anyone shot her from a passageway, Williams would have seen them. If Mr. Fellows and Mr. Berkeley are telling the truth, she wasn't shot from the room opposite. With due deference, sir," he gazed at Fenn, without a hint of deference in his manner, "I don't see how it can be anything but suicide.
Of course I shall keep an open mind on the subject, but it seems to me there's really very little doubt about it." "Well, I'm sure we can leave matters safely in your hands, Inspector. And now, perhaps, bed?" The sense of relief caused by the suggestion engendered surprisingly a tendency to linger in amiable chatter. Eventually Sir Richard and the Inspector departed, Nigel remaining behind a few moments, and Fenn, abandoning equally his theatrical gloom and his unnatural exuberance, was looking impressively grave. "Talk to me about abstract justice." "Abstract justice?" murmured Nigel. "Pascal says that human justice is entirely relative, and that there is no crime which has not at one time or another been considered as a virtuous action. He confuses, of course, universal moral law with actions valuable through temporary expediency. The question is it worth while for anyone to hang for the murder of that young woman? I don't like it. I don't like it at all." "You think you know who killed her, sir?" "Oh, yes. Perhaps I should have said that the conditions are such that they can only be fulfilled by one person. It was easy enough to find out who that one person was, but there are admittedly complications which will have to be looked at. It's possible I'm wrong. Miss McGaw woman. Are you in love with Helen?" "I hardly know her." "I'll walk with you to the gate." A half-moon hung lopsidedly over the great tower. The air was warm with a warmth that at once sapped physical energy and presaged a tremendous imminent change. They trudged across the quadrangle beneath the delicate, finical gaiety of Inigo Jones, transformed by the darkness to a rather sinister, empty lecherousness. Nigel was reminded of Wilkes's ghost story. "By the way, remind me some time to give you my opinion of Wilkes's story. It interested me in more ways than one, and the problems of the dead are so much more satisfactory to solve than the problems of the living. They require no effective action." "I suppose." "How tired I feel. I must go and get some collection papers for the bookish crew who return tomorrow." He vanished on the raven dawn of darkness, and the single word "cretins" floated faintly back to Nigel's ear. Nigel, now that he had arrived in the open air, felt disinclined for sleep, and walked down past Christchurch to the towpath by the canal, and stood gazing down into the water, in which patches of luminous white and jet black performed silent, bewildering manoeuvres. The gasworks, the factory chimneys, and the railway siding, from which the distant clatter of shunting goods trains could be heard from time to time, stood silhouetted against the moon, like a Muirhead bone etching. Somewhere, far away, an air raid siren began its dismal portamento progression of minor thirds. Little by little the events of evening seeped back, rearranged themselves in fantastic patterns, clamoured for explanation, for scrutiny, even for dismissal. The figures of the participants inconsequently mingled in strange relationships. Broken phrases returned and became perverted to extraordinary senses. The rational element, sated and wearied, stood back to regard with impotent disapproval this grotesque panorama. Was there for a moment a fleeting glimpse of the true pattern? Nigel never knew. Hunching his shoulders despite the warmth of the evening, he returned to the hotel. That night he dreamed he was once again on the lawn of St. Christopher's, only it seemed somehow different, and the college receded to an infinite distance even as he looked at it. He was vaguely aware that Helen was clinging to the lower boughs of a tree and shouting something at him. It was only after a time that he realized she'd taken refuge there. Looking about, he saw something on hands and knees crawling towards him through the bushes. The features, which were terribly distorted, were those of someone he knew. But when he woke up, shaking himself irritably free of the nightmare, and lit a cigarette, he could not remember whose they had been.